There's something deeply unsettling about a roller coaster that doesn't move anymore. The tracks are still there, the seats are still bolted in, but the screaming has been replaced by wind, rust, and the occasional bird. America is full of places like this. Hundreds of them, actually. Parks that once packed in thousands of families on summer weekends, now slowly being swallowed by weeds and silence. So today, we're going inside the abandoned amusement parks of America and asking what went wrong. Part 8. The big picture nobody talks about. Before we get into the individual parks, let's set the stage, because the scale of this is genuinely staggering. According to the National Amusement Park Historical Association, there are approximately 1,000 defunct amusement parks in North America. 1,000. Most people couldn't name 5. These weren't all tiny roadside operations either. Some were major regional attractions that defined entire summers for entire generations of American families, and they're gone. The reasons for closures have shifted across different eras. In the early 20th century, fire was the leading cause of park shutdowns, largely because most structures were built from wood and the parks had little in the way of fire suppression. The Great Depression of the 1930s shut down dozens more when families simply couldn't afford the admission. Then came the post-war highway boom of the 1950s and 1960s, which had a complicated effect. It opened up travel for some parks, but allowed bigger competitors to suddenly become accessible to audiences that were previously trapped in smaller regional markets. A family that once drove 20 minutes to the local park could now realistically make a weekend trip to something 3 times the size. The local park rarely survived that comparison. The 1970s brought inflation, the oil crisis, rising insurance costs, and a general tightening of wallets across the country. Many parks that had survived the Depression couldn't survive that decade. Then the 1980s and 1990s saw the explosion of megaparks, Disney, Six Flags, Cedar Point, built on enormous budgets with marketing machines behind them. The smaller, independently owned parks that had served communities for 50 or 70 years were now competing with something they had no business competing with, and they knew it. What's interesting is that the closures weren't always dramatic. In fact, most of them were quiet. No press release, no farewell season, no tearful last day with fireworks. A lot of these parks just locked the gates one October and never opened them again in the spring. The rides sat there, the concession stands sat there, and nature, which is extremely patient, started moving back in. There's also the sheer geography of the problem. These parks were built in every corner of the country, along lake shores in Ohio, in the Ozark Highlands of Arkansas, on swampland in Louisiana, on the Great Plains of Kansas. Their fates were shaped by local economies, local politics, local weather patterns, and the preferences of communities that often had no idea the park was struggling until the gates were already locked. The closures were regional news at best, invisible at worst. A park that had operated for 80 years in a small town might close without a single national outlet noticing. And then 20 years later, urban explorers with cameras would post footage of it online, and suddenly millions of people would care deeply about something that nobody bothered to document when it was still alive. Part 7. Chippewa Lake Park, Ohio. 100 years ended without a word. If you want to understand how a park can simply disappear without anyone noticing, Chippewa Lake Park in Medina County, Ohio, is the textbook case. The park opened in 1878. Let that sink in. 1878. It predates the automobile. It predates the light bulb being widely used. When it first opened as Andrew's Pleasure Grounds, guests arrived by carriage or by steamboat across Chippewa Lake. The original roller coaster had to be manually pushed back up the track after each ride. Not exactly Space Mountain, but people loved it. By the time Mac Beach acquired the property in 1898 and began transforming it into a real amusement destination, Chippewa Lake was drawing crowds from across northeast Ohio. In the 1920s and 1930s, the park hosted live big band performances throughout the week, every week of the summer season. Glenn Miller played there. Tommy Dorsey played there, Paul Anka played there, Jerry Lee Lewis played there. For a lakeside park in rural Ohio, that is a genuinely remarkable roster. One local resident, Gail Foster, later recalled that her brother saw Neil Diamond perform there before he was famous, which is exactly the kind of thing that sounds like someone misremembering, but it actually checks out. The The park operated for a full century, 3 roller coasters over its lifetime, a Ferris wheel, a tumble bug ride, a carousel, flying cages, a ballroom, a hotel. Chippewa Lake was called, without irony, Ohio's most beautiful playground. It had earned that title. For families in Medina County and the surrounding region, it was not a destination you discovered, it was simply part of life, the way summer itself was part of life. You went to Chippewa. You went every year. You took your kids when you had kids. That kind of embedded presence in a community's calendar is almost impossible to manufacture. It builds over generations, and it's the reason the park's eventual closure felt so disorienting even to people who didn't go there often. Something that had always been there simply wasn't anymore. Then, in 1978, exactly its 100th year of operation, the park closed. Not with a parade, not with a tribute season. It closed at the end of summer with no announcement, no media coverage, and no public statement of any kind. Employees showed up expecting to work the following spring. Vendors expected their contracts to continue. Nobody told them. The closure came down to a standoff between the park's corporate owner, Continental Business Enterprises, and local government officials who were demanding the company fund certain infrastructure upgrades before approving the company's redevelopment plans. Both sides apparently believed the other would back down. Neither did. The park's centennial season turned out to be its last, and virtually nobody knew it at the time. What followed was even stranger. Because nobody expected a permanent closure, everything was left exactly as it was. Beds made in the hotel, tables set in the ballroom, tools laid out in the maintenance sheds. The whole place sat in an off-season posture, waiting for a spring that never came. For years, people thought it might still reopen. It didn't. By the 2000s, the ballroom had burned down in an act of arson. Trees were growing through the Ferris wheel, and the roller coaster had been demolished. As of 2024, the Ferris wheel, the Little Dipper coaster frame, the tumble bug structure, and the flying cages are still standing on the former grounds. The Medina County Park District has approved plans to open the site as a nature park and preserve what remains with a historical museum in the works. The former park owner, Parker Beach, had requested to be buried somewhere on the grounds when he died. His family honored that wish. The exact location of his grave is unknown. Part 6. Dogpatch USA, Arkansas. When a comic strip dies, so does the park. Some park concepts are so tied to a single cultural moment that when that moment passes, there's genuinely nothing left to hold the whole thing up. Dogpatch USA in Marble Falls, Arkansas is one of the clearest examples of that dynamic ever built. The park opened in 1968 and was themed entirely around Lil Abner, the long-running newspaper comic strip created by Al Cap that depicted a fictional hillbilly town called Dogpatch. In the late 1960s, this made a certain amount of sense. Country-themed entertainment was doing well. Green Acres, the Beverly Hillbillies, and Petticoat Junction were all popular on television, and a rustic, character-driven park built on an Ozark trout farm had legitimate appeal. The park's original budget was $1,332,000. For that, investors got horseback riding, paddle boats, a cave attraction, a small roller coaster, a toboggan coaster, a miniature train, and Al Cap's costumed characters wandering the grounds performing hillbilly comedy routines. Cap was closely involved from the start, attending major milestones, including the unveiling of a giant statue of the fictional hero Jubilation T. Cornpone in front of a crowd of about 2,000 people. A consulting firm projected the park would attract over 1 million visitors annually within a decade. In its first year, Dogpatch welcomed approximately 300,000 visitors. Not 1 million, but not bad. The problem was that the park's business model had been built on projections that never materialized, and the expansion plans that followed were poorly timed and poorly funded. A partner ski resort called Marble Falls was built on the hill overlooking the park, designed to allow year-round operations. A series of unusually mild Arkansas winters immediately made that idea look foolish. Snowmaking equipment was delayed. Interest rates climbed. The Arab oil embargo of the mid-1970s cut into family road trips across the board, and then, crucially, Al Cap retired in 1977 and ended the Lil Abner comic strip entirely. The park had been built around a cultural property that no longer existed. Younger visitors had never read Lil Abner, and had no connection to the characters. The hillbilly theme that once felt charming started to feel dated. By 1978, the park recorded its last profitable year. When Dogpatch opened in 1968 and then it closed in 1993, it wasn't just owned by one company, said one analyst who studied the park's history. It changed owners several times, and each time an owner contributed to why that park ultimately didn't succeed. Through the 1980s, Dogpatch changed hands multiple times. In 1991, facing severe financial strain, the park dropped the Lil Abner licensing entirely, partly to avoid paying the cap estate for use of the name and characters, and rebranded itself simply as Dogpatch Arkansas. Without the theme, there was very little left to offer. The park closed permanently on October 14, 1993. In the years following the closure, the property was auctioned on courthouse steps, changed hands through bankruptcy, and at one point the owners tried to sell the entire site on eBay for $1 million. There were no bidders. A subsequent owner was awarded the land as part of a lawsuit settlement after sustaining a serious injury in an ATV accident on the property. In 2020, Johnny Morris, the founder of Bass Pro Shops, purchased the land with plans to develop it into Marble Falls Nature Park. The old signpost is still visible along Highway 7. The roller coaster frames still peek through the trees. Part 5. Joyland, Kansas, a family park that fought to the very end. Not all abandoned parks went quietly. Joyland Amusement Park in Wichita, Kansas, fought for survival for years before the last pieces of it were either demolished or burned. Joyland opened on June 12, 1949. Founded by Lester Ottaway and his sons Herbert and Harold. The origin story is oddly wholesome. Herb had purchased a vintage 12-inch gauge miniature steam locomotive in 1933, originally built between 1905 and 1910 and acquired from a defunct park in Fort Scott, and spent years hauling it to county fairs across Kansas and Colorado. By 1949, the family decided the train needed a permanent home. Joyland was built around it. The park grew steadily over the following decades. Its wooden roller coaster, built by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, became the centerpiece attraction, rising 80 feet and hitting 50 miles per hour. It was built with a track span of 2,600 feet and became one of the last surviving classic wooden coasters of its kind in North America. The park also featured a Wurlitzer-style number 160 organ installed in 1950, complete with Louie, an animatronic clown who sat at the keyboard and appeared to play it. Louie became beloved by generations of Wichita kids and utterly terrifying to many of them. The Ottoways sold the park to Stanley and Margaret Nelson in 1975. Margaret had actually worked at Joyland years before, meeting Stan at the skee ball booth. They ran it together for 3 decades and added many of its most memorable rides, including the Wacky Shack Dark Ride in 1974, a 2-story Bill Tracy-designed attraction that became a park institution. By the early 2000s, the park was suffering. Safety concerns led to a regulatory investigation, and a combination of those concerns with mounting financial losses forced the park to close during the 2004 and 2005 seasons. In 2006, a Seattle-based company called T-Rex Group leased the property and attempted a comeback. They made cosmetic improvements, repainted the roller coaster, renamed it The Nightmare, replaced some pump systems, but the deeper structural and financial issues were never addressed. The park closed again at the end of the 2006 season and never reopened. Stanley Nelson died in 2010, never seeing the park revived. What followed was a slow, ugly dismantling. Arson became a recurring problem. On April 14, 2009, the Opera House burned. In August 2018, the Wacky Shack, one of the last remaining original structures, was destroyed by fire. In April 2015, a windstorm tore apart large sections of the wooden roller coaster, and what remained was demolished for safety reasons. Between the weather, the fires, and deliberate demolition, almost nothing survived. A few things did. Louie the Clown, who had gone missing for over a decade, was located by Wichita police in February 2015 at the home of a former park employee who had maintained him and the organ. The 1949 carousel carefully disassembled and cleaned at the end of every season for over 60 years, was donated by Margaret Nelson to the Botanica Gardens in Wichita. After restoration, it opened to the public in November 2019. It still has all 36 of its original horses. To all of us who grew up in Wichita, all of us have rode on that merry-go-round, said Marty Miller, director of Botanica, when the carousel was restored. There's something quietly moving about that carousel's survival. A park that was hit by fires, gutted by vandalism, demolished piece by piece over more than a decade. And the thing that made it out was the gentlest attraction in the place. The carousel that was carefully taken apart every October and put back together every spring for 60 consecutive years by people who actually cared about it. The roller coaster burned and collapsed. The clown went missing for a decade. But the carousel made it because someone kept doing the unglamorous maintenance work long after there was any obvious reason to keep doing it. That's a lesson that goes well beyond amusement parks. The land itself was auctioned in November 2018 for $198,000, a fraction of what the park had represented to the city for more than half a century. Part 4. Six Flags New Orleans. The sign that said, "Closed for storm." Of all the abandoned parks in America, Six Flags New Orleans may be the most photographed. Its decaying roller coasters, the overgrown Looney Tunes murals, the alligators moving through the rides. It has become one of the defining images of post-Katrina New Orleans. But the story of how that park ended up in ruins is more complicated than one hurricane. The park originally opened on May 20th, 2000 under the name Jazzland. It was built on 227 acres of low-lying swampland in eastern New Orleans, near Lake Pontchartrain, and was designed to celebrate the city's culture. The themed sections included Jazz Plaza, Cajun Country, and Mardi Gras. The wooden roller coaster, the Mega Zeph, was the flagship attraction. The park brought in 300,000 visitors in its first season. Then the problems started. Attendance dropped sharply in the second year, partly because the park had almost no shade and no water rides. In New Orleans in July, that is not a minor oversight. The original owners went bankrupt in 2002. Six Flags acquired the lease the same year for $22 million, signing an ambitious 75-year agreement with the city. Six Flags spent $20 million on improvements, added Warner Brothers characters, installed Batman, the ride, a relocated inverted coaster, and reopened the park as Six Flags New Orleans in 2003. But Six Flags itself was in financial difficulty. The company had been on an aggressive acquisition spree throughout the late 1990s, buying up 31 parks in 4 years, and lost $122 million in just the first half of 2003. The New Orleans park was among the least profitable in its portfolio. In 2005, the company closed and demolished its Astro World Park in Houston, and New Orleans was likely next on the list regardless of anything else. Then came August 29, 2005. Hurricane Katrina made landfall in southeast Louisiana, causing 1,464 deaths and over $100 billion in damage. The park had closed its gates 8 days earlier for the end of summer. The plan was to reopen for a final weekend on August 27th, but Katrina's projected path changed that. The sign out front was updated to read "Closed for Storm." That sign would remain frozen in place for years. The park's drainage system, which had been installed specifically because the site was built on swampland, was overwhelmed almost immediately. Water from Lake Pontchartrain flooded the entire property. By the time the water subsided, the park had been submerged under 6 to 7 feet of corrosive, brackish water for over a month. About 80% of its attractions were destroyed. Six Flags attempted to recover $150 million from insurers but failed. Most of the policies specifically excluded flood damage. In 2006, Six Flags formally declared the park a total loss and began negotiating an exit from the 75-year lease. The only ride deemed worth salvaging was Batman, the ride, which was shipped to Six Flags Fiesta Texas in San Antonio and reopened there in 2008 under the name Goliath. For nearly 2 decades after that, the site sat, rotting, overgrown, occupied by wild boars, alligators, vultures, and cottonmouth snakes. It became a magnet for urban explorers, film crews, and photographers. The movies Killer Joe, Stolen, Percy Jackson, Sea of Monsters, and Dawn of the Planet of the Apes were all filmed there. The roller coaster skeletons were visible from Interstate 510, a constant reminder of what Katrina had done. In 2023, the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority approved a plan by developer Bayou Phoenix to transform the 227-acre site into a youth sports complex, hotels, a film studio, and other amenities. Demolition began in October 2024. The Megazeph roller coaster, the last major remaining structure, was demolished on February 5th, 2025. It was a spot my sisters and I loved going to, as it was one of the biggest attractions in the city for families, said Fox weather correspondent Brandy Campbell, who grew up in the area. The big rides were my favorites, like the Megazeph. Part 3. Lake Shawnee, West Virginia, a park that probably shouldn't have been built at all. If Six Flags New Orleans represents institutional failure layered on top of natural disaster, Lake Shawnee Amusement Park in Princeton, West Virginia, represents something harder to categorize, because long before the park existed, the land it was built on already had a history. The site was originally inhabited by the Shawnee people. In the late 18th century, a settler named Mitchell Clay established an 800-acre farm on the land. In August 1783, a Shawnee raiding party attacked the Clay family while the men were away hunting. Two of Clay's children, his daughter Tabitha and his son Bartley, were killed. A third child, Ezekiel, was taken captive and later burned at the stake in Ohio. The event became known as the Clover Bottom Massacre. Later, after the land changed hands through the 19th century, human remains and Native American artifacts were found on the property, revealing it had long served as a burial ground. None of that history was widely known in 1926, when entrepreneur Conley Sneedo purchased the land and opened Lake Shawnee Amusement Park. The park operated as a fairly typical regional attraction: a Ferris wheel, a swing ride, a swimming pool, a dance hall, a racetrack, and cabins for overnight stays. It became a popular summertime destination for families of coal workers in the region. But over the years, a series of deaths occurred on the property. A young girl was struck by a truck while playing on the swings. A little boy drowned in the swimming pool. The park closed in 1966 after those incidents. In 1985, a man named Gaylord White, who had worked at the park as a youth, purchased the land, originally intending to subdivide it and sell residential lots. But when construction crews began excavating, they unearthed human remains and Native American artifacts across the property. White abandoned the development plan entirely. Instead, he reopened the amusement park, but it only lasted until 1988, when rising insurance costs made continued operation impossible. An archaeological dig that same year confirmed what the construction crews had found. 13 skeletal remains, mostly children, were recovered from the grounds. The property is privately owned and remains in an ongoing state of partial abandonment. It is open for tours by appointment, including overnight ghost hunting visits and an annual Halloween event called the Dark Carnival. The original Ferris wheel still stands, as do the swing ride and a few other structures, rusting and weathered. Some visitors come for the history, others come hoping to experience whatever the history supposedly left behind. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most quietly haunting places in rural America, not because of anything supernatural, but because it embeds a series of tragedies: indigenous displacement, accidental death, failed enterprise, into a setting that was always supposed to be about fun. Part 2. What killed them all? Looking across all of these parks, and the hundreds of others like them scattered across every state, certain patterns become clear. Competition was the most consistent killer. Cedar Point is often cited as the park that doomed many Midwestern competitors, including Chippewa Lake. But the broader pressure came from the way American leisure changed after the 1970s. When Disney World opened in Florida in 1971, it reset public expectations for what an amusement park could be. Regional parks that had operated comfortably for decades now had to justify themselves against a standard they couldn't meet. Most of them couldn't, and most of them didn't. Management failures also played a central role. Dogpatch USA is a near-perfect case study in how a series of owners, each making individually plausible decisions, can collectively drive a park to ruin. The ski resort built on borrowed money, the licensing fees paid to a comic strip that was losing readers, the ownership changes that came with no stable long-term strategy. Insurance costs were a recurring issue that rarely gets enough attention. Lake Shawnee closed the second time primarily because of insurance rates. Joyland couldn't sustain the costs of maintaining aging infrastructure. As parks aged and rides required more maintenance, the gap between what insurance required and what revenue could support often became impossible to close. Natural disasters played a role in a handful of cases, most dramatically in New Orleans, but also in other parks across the Gulf South and the Midwest that were hit by floods, fires, and storms at moments when they were already financially vulnerable. A park with reserves and strong management can rebuild. A park already on the edge often can't. And then there's something harder to name: a simple exhaustion of public interest in a particular kind of experience. The Midway, the wooden coaster, the carousel, the Ferris wheel. For most of American history, these were genuinely exciting. They were novel. By the 1990s, they faced competition not just from bigger parks, but from home video, the internet, and eventually smartphones. The family's leisure time was being fought over by more players than ever, and the local park with a 50-year-old roller coaster was not winning. What often gets overlooked is how the park's own success worked against them. Many of the most beloved regional parks were family-run operations, built by one person or one family, expanded over decades by the same people, maintained through personal relationships with the community. The Ottoways built Joyland around a train. The Beach family ran Chippewa Lake through its best years. When those founders aged out and sold to corporations or outside investors, something essential was usually lost. The new owners often didn't understand the park's appeal, didn't have roots in the communities they served, and were inclined to see the properties as assets to be restructured rather than institutions to be sustained. That shift, from a family operating a park to a company managing an investment, shows up repeatedly in the collapsed timelines of these places. Part 1. The people who won't let them go. There is, in all of this, something worth noting that doesn't fit neatly into the failure narrative. A substantial number of Americans are genuinely obsessed with these places. YouTube channels dedicated to exploring and documenting abandoned amusement parks have accumulated millions of views. The Defunctland channel, which covers the history of defunct parks and rides, has produced video essays with production values that rival broadcast documentaries. Online communities exchange photographs, oral histories, and technical details about parks that closed before many of their members were born. The National Amusement Park Historical Association has spent decades trying to document all 1,000 defunct parks across North America, acknowledging that the task may take many more years to complete. The interest isn't simply a taste for ruins or nostalgia, though both are part of it. These parks represent a particular version of American optimism, the belief that a few acres of land, some wooden coasters, a carousel, and a good summer could build something that mattered to a community. Most of them delivered on that promise for decades. The fact that they're gone doesn't entirely erase what they meant while they existed. The carousel from Joyland still turns, restored, in a Wichita garden. Some of the Ferris wheel at Chippewa Lake is still standing, trees beginning to grow back through it. The site of Six Flags New Orleans is finally being cleared, nearly 20 years after Katrina. And somewhere in rural West Virginia, the Lake Shawnee swing ride still hangs from its rusted frame, waiting for weather and time to finish the job. These parks aren't coming back, at least not as they were, but the stories they carry are genuinely worth knowing. Because the reasons they failed, overextension, competition, neglect, bad timing, and sometimes we genuinely like to hear it, are not unique to amusement parks. They're the story of a lot of American ambition. If this kind of history is your thing, hit like and subscribe. We go deep on places and stories that most people have completely forgotten about. And if you grew up near any of these parks or remember them, drop a comment below. We'd genuinely like to hear it.